Although the attack on Pearl Harbor came as a shock to most Americans, the gauntlet of war had been laid down nearly a year earlier, when the Roosevelt administration announced a crushing embargo of oil, steel, and scrap iron on the island nation of Japan. The United Kingdom and the Netherlands quickly followed suit. This single act forced Imperial Japan, a nation of few natural resources, to strike out against the Western Allies, thereby securing its own supply of strategic resources to fuel its ever-expanding empire. What follows is an alternate history of the Pacific theater during the Second World War, as told through the masterfully designed board game, Fire in the Sky, by Tetsuya Nakamura. It is 7:50 a.m. December 7, 1941, and the planes of the Japanese strike force are just rounding Diamond Head. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the strike leader, radios back to Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the famous words, "Tora, Tora, Tora." The Great Pacific War is about to begin.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Solo Gamers Club. Tonight's video will be a re-implementation of some previous videos that I've released for Fire in the Sky, The Great Pacific War, 1941 to 1945. I've decided to reissue the material as I wasn't pleased with how they turned out, and I want all this preliminary information to be contained in a single video. In part 1 of this installment, I'll introduce you to a few player aids that I've created. These have been designed to help the viewers follow along with the playthrough, and they should add a bit of historical feel to the design. In part 2, I'll discuss Scenario 2, from Pearl Harbor to Japanese surrender, where we'll examine some of the scenario rules, along with some optional and user-created rules that I'll be using during the playthrough. In part 3, I'll walk the viewers through my opening moves for Japan, and I'll discuss the strategy behind these proposals. The first of my player aids is a redesign of the battle board. I noticed in my previous videos that the color schemes of the battle board were a bit difficult to see on camera. So I've designed a new battle board using more contrast. This should make it easier for the viewers to follow along. Working hand in hand with the battle board, I've designed some custom counters that I'll use during the playthrough. These will allow me to graphically show how the aircraft are being assigned during battle resolution. First set of these aircraft counters are the Japanese aircraft. I have one for the Japanese elite pilots, which we'll be using during this playthrough. They're denoted with a Japanese naval ensign, and the A6M5 is in the pre-war gray color scheme. At the top in Japanese script is the word elite. Next counter is a A6M5 in the 1943 green color scheme, and that has the standard Japanese ensign. Finally, we have kamikaze counters. Those are sporting the Japanese ensign, and at the top in Japanese script we have the word kamikaze. For the US counters, we have an American Hellcat with the US flag, and for the British we have a Spitfire with the British ensign. I've also created a set of tactical submarine counters that we can use that will denote which task forces are being stalked by submarines. I've also made a set of custom control counters. Rather than using the cubes, we'll be using these to denote base control. We've got the Japanese, US, British, and Australia and New Zealand. Also included are some historic admirals and generals who commanded naval and ground forces during the conflict. These are included as chrome and have no impact on the game. Some of the tokens serve as reminders, such as the Mark 14 torpedoes repaired, which occurs on turn 6, and Japanese naval anti-aircraft upgrade, which occurs on turn 10. I've also created some helpful cards that will remind me of some of the special conditions that will exist during turn 1 and will also aid me in remembering some of my custom rules that I'll be implementing during the playthrough. The battle board is designed to be printed on 11 by 17 photo paper using marginless settings. Eventually, after you cut it, it's going to be an 11 by 11 sheet that will fit inside the game box. I've chosen to mount mine in a picture frame. The counter sheets are printed out on 8.5 by 11 photo paper, and then they're cut to size using a paper cutter and a 1-inch diameter paper punch. I purchased a set of 1-inch square wood counters and 1-inch diameter circular counters from Amazon. And I mounted those images that we cut out using an Elmer's glue stick, and those are the counters that you saw previously. Now switching on to the scenario that we'll be playing. It's Scenario 2 from Pearl Harbor to Japanese surrender. That encompasses 16 turns and covers the entire Pacific campaign. It includes 4 scenario special rules that highlight the surprise nature of the Japanese attacks and the Allies' woeful unpreparedness during December 1941. For the Allies, we'll be including the following optional rules. Gentlemen, do not read other people's mail. Man, those decks are hard. Curtis LeMay wants to help win the war. Ranger to the rescue. And Semper Fi. For Japan, we'll be using the optional rules Long Lance torpedoes, Tokyo Express, elite and not so elite pilots, a divine wind, I want it all, and naval AA upgrade program. I'll also be adding 3 user-created rules as well. These are entitled Midget Submarines, Nothing is for Certain, and the Burma Road. Midget submarines allow the Japanese player to spend a subpoint to attempt a midget submarine attack on an Allied port during turn 1. This simulates the Japanese employing their top-secret Type A Kohoteki class midget submarines, as they did historically at Pearl Harbor, in Sydney Harbor, and in Madagascar, all with varying degrees of success. The Nothing is for Certain rule makes any roll of a natural 1 a miss, regardless of any dice roll modifiers that might be in place. This has been implemented to stop auto hits by elite pilots during turn 1. Finally, the Burma Road simulates the Allied efforts to supply China through the Burma and Lido roads. If Japan can occupy and hold both Rangoon and Burma during turns 5 through 12, they prevent the Allies from earning 1/2 victory point per turn. Conversely, the Allies can prevent Japan from earning a 1/2 victory point per turn during turns 13 through 16 by occupying Burma. Now let's take a look at my opening moves for Japan. I prepared a Word file that is going to document all of these proposed moves that I have for Japan on turn 1, along with some conclusions that I've arrived at the end of the document. I'm going to put these up on the screen, and you can pause the video and read that if you choose to. I will eventually be posting these files on the BGG site, so you can have access to my battle board and counters if you choose to use those. Our Japanese turn 1 objectives are Pearl Harbor. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in a lightning surprise attack and buy time for the Japanese conquest of the Pacific before the U.S. can respond. The Philippines. Neutralize U.S. air assets at Clark Field and destroy the U.S. 6th Army defending Manila. That is going to net us 3 victory points. Then we have the Thailand, Malaya, and Burma theater. Occupy Thailand and prepare for an attack on Rangoon. Use air attacks to neutralize British forces on the Malayan Peninsula, and that will net us 1 victory point. Then in the Dutch East Indies, occupy Brunei, seizing its oil production facilities, and prepare for the invasion of Surabaya. That will net us 1 victory point and some oil production sites. The Central Pacific. Occupy the Gilbert Islands and Wake Island to form a defensive barrier against future U.S. counterattacks. Those landings will produce 2 victory points. And finally, in the South Pacific, occupy both Rabaul and Lae, threatening Port Moresby and thereby threatening to sever the U.S.-Australian line of communications. This will directly earn us 2 victory points. We'll begin with the economic phase. And although this would be a golden opportunity to place destroyer assets into the convoy escort box, seeing as the transport point marker will be reset during the first reinforcement phase, I cannot spare the escorts at this time, so we will not be placing any units in the convoy escort box. Now we'll switch to the Japanese first deployment phase. The Pearl Harbor strike, the attack on the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, and Burma, and the Dutch East Indies will not require any deployments. We have the forces available already in position. Our attacks in the Central Pacific will require 1 movement. Eventually, we're going to create the Wake Island Carrier Support Group. We're going to move the light carrier Zuho Shoho. It's currently at Palau. We'll use a 1-hex deployment to move that to Truk. That's going to place that carrier within 4 hexes of Wake Island. The light carrier, along with the destroyer from Truk, is going to join the invasion force that's located in Iwo Jima, and that is 3 hexes from the invasion point. And we do have the Marshall Islands within 2 to justify Wake as an amphib qualified location. Movement of the light carrier costs no transport points, as that's a 1-hex deployment. Next up, we have to make preparations for our South Pacific invasion of Lae. We're going to create eventually a Lae invasion force, which will consist of the 2nd Infantry Division, currently at Kore. The 2nd Division will use 3 movement points and move to the Marianas. That movement is going to cost us 4 transport points, moving us down from 60 down to 56. As a part of that force creation, we're going to take a destroyer from Palau and move that 2 hexes northeast to the Marianas. I would have normally liked to have had that 2nd Division move to Palau, but the stacking requirements are going to be enforced at the end of this round. And Palau only has a ground capacity of 4 points. There's already the Kawaguchi Brigade there, so that would have exceeded our total. Next up, we're going to create a Lae carrier support force consisting of the light carrier Hosho and Ryuko and a destroyer squadron currently based at Kure. They're going to move 4 movement points to Palau. It's going to cost us 3 transport points. That'll reduce our transport capacity to 53. We'll be making a 1-hex deployment, and we're going to move the 15th Army from Saigon into Bangkok. And finally, we're going to make 1 miscellaneous movement, and that's going to be to create eventually an Okinawa surface group. We're going to take the heavy cruiser Tone, currently based in Kore, and we're going to move 1 hex to Okinawa. And that will cost no transport points. That's a 1 hex move. And that's going to complete our first deployment. During that first deployment, we've spent a total of 7 transport points. Now we're going to move on with our Japanese operations phase. Our first step is to create the Pearl Harbor Strike Force that will consist of the Kido Butai, the fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, and a destroyer squadron. Those are currently based in Yokosuka. We're going to be using our Plan Z pre-war planning, and that will allow us to create that force and move it to any base on the map. Force cost of that will be 12 oil points. That force is going to constitute our Pearl Harbor Strike Force. That force will move 3,500 miles from Yokosuka to Pearl Harbor, and that will be our strike force for the Pearl Harbor attack. That will cost us 12 oil points, moving us down from 60 to 48. Next up is our Gilbert Islands invasion force. That's currently located in the Marshalls. We're going to form the force consisting of the Nankai Brigade, escorted by a destroyer squadron. It's going to move 1 hex into the Gilbert Islands. It's going to cost us 1 oil point and 4 transport points, moving us down to 47 oil and 49 transport points. Next up is our Philippine Island invasion force. That will consist of the 14th Army, the heavy cruiser Furitaka, and a destroyer squadron. Those are presently at Formosa. They're going to use 1 movement point and move from Formosa to Manila. And that's going to cost us a massive 16 transport points and 3 oil points. That will move our available transport points down to 33 and our oil down to 44. Next up is our Wake Island force. That will consist of an invasion force with the Special Naval Landing Force Brigade and a destroyer currently at Iwo Jima. They're going to activate into a task force, moving 3 movement points from Iwo Jima to Wake Island. And that force is going to cost us 1 oil point and 4 transport points. That will leave us with 29 transport and 43 oil. We're also going to create a carrier support group consisting of the light carriers Zuho and Shoho and a destroyer. They're currently based in Truk. They're going to move 4 movement points from Truk to Wake Island. That movement will cost us 3 oil points, moving us down to 40 oil. Next up is our Rabaul invasion force. Now that's going to be using the Tokyo Express counter, which is going to give us first fire if any Allied units choose to respond to the landings. It's going to consist of the Achiki Brigade, the heavy cruiser Takeo, and a destroyer squadron currently based in Truk. Force will move 2 movement points south to the Rabaul invasion landing area. It's going to cost us a total of 3 oil points and 4 transport points. It leaves us with 25 transport and 37 oil. Next up is our Leh invasion force. It's going to consist of the 2nd Division and a destroyer escort currently at the Marianas. Unit will be moved 4 hexes to the south-southwest to the Leh invasion site. That'll cost us a total of 8 transport and 1 oil point, leaving us with 17 transport and 36 oil. We'll also be assembling a carrier support group consisting of the light carriers Hosho and Ryuko and a destroyer currently based at Palau. It's going to move 2 movement points south to Leh, and that's going to cost us 3 oil points. Next up is our Brunei group. We're going to begin with creating an invasion force in Palau consisting of the Kawaguchi Brigade, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and a destroyer escort. The group will form the task force and move 3 movement points to Brunei. It's going to cost us a total of 3 oil points and 4 transport points. We'll also be including a support group that will be coming from Hainan. That will consist of a single destroyer unit, and that's going to move 2 movement points from Hainan to Brunei. And that will cost us 1 oil point, moving us down to 29 oil. And that completes the operations phase. In total, our dispersals were a total of 31 oil points and 48 transport points. I had an error in calculation when I forgot to account for that destroyer that we moved to the Marianas, but our total is 29 oil and 12 transport remaining. During the return to base phase, we're going to send all the units back to Kure. Then during our second deployment, we're going to reserve 7 transport points for oil transfer, and we're going to use the other 5 to move a destroyer from Kure to Hainan, and the Zuhyo and 2 destroyers from Kure to Palau. That will serve as a reaction force that we can use in the event that the Allies get a little on the frisky side. Our expected victory point totals would be our existing 20 points, plus with the capture of Bangkok, Wake, Gilbert Islands, Rabaul, Leh, and Brunei, netting us 6 victory points, we'd have 26 victory points at the close of turn 1. That's 65% of our automatic victory conditions. When using the battle plan that I've outlined above, the Allies will be hard-pressed to respond to any of the initial Japanese attacks. However, this plan is not without its risks. The attack on Manila is critical, especially the airstrikes against U.S. aircraft at Clark Field. If Japan's surprise attack goes awry, any surviving U.S. aircraft can cause major headaches, especially with the transit of oil from captured resource locations, and with the proposed second deployment actions. An argument can be made that the light carrier Hosho and Ryuko would be better served supporting the attack on the Philippines rather than assisting the Leh invasion. However, I feel the possibility of an Australian response against this lightly protected Leh invasion force is greater than the likelihood of failing to knock out U.S. air assets at Clark Field. It could also be argued that the carrier support group being attached to the Leh landings is unnecessary, as the Tokyo Express counter could be used with this landing rather than at Rabaul, which would likely dissuade all but the most aggressive Allied players. Time will only tell. Another threat involved with this plan is the delay of landing Yamashita's 25th Army in Singapore. This is definitely a calculated risk. If Singapore is not captured by the start of turn 4, this also applies to Manila as well, the Japanese will lose a precious victory point at the start of each turn, and this could compromise any hope of achieving the 40-point knockout blow. The most significant intangible is the disposition of the U.S. carrier reaction force. If this force appears at Wake, the invasion will be in a world of trouble. However, if it appears at Pearl Harbor, well, we can only hope. It is my belief that the key to a Japanese automatic victory lies in the warm blue waters of the South Pacific. This is why I'm advocating for the invasion of Leh during the December 1941 turn. The appearance of the 2nd Division in Leh will place an enormous amount of pressure on the Allied player to defend one of the most critical locations on the map, Port Moresby. Remember, Japanese control of Port Moresby allows the possibility of an invasion of Australia. If one was exceptionally bold, a separate task force could be formed in Truk to deliver 1 or 2 air points to Rabaul during the Turn 1 operational phase. This would make any Allied reinforcement attempts of Port Moresby more costly. Unfortunately, this would likely have to come at the cost of delaying either the Wake Island or Gilbert Island invasions, as those forces would be needed for the transport task. The delay of either of these invasions could make the transfer of the 19th or 21st Regiments from Pearl Harbor to one of these locations a distinct possibility. Severing the line of communications between the U.S. West Coast and Brisbane will earn Japan 2 victory points during every end phase while this condition persists. Accomplishing this is, however, no easy task. This will require Japan to either seize Brisbane outright or control one of the South Seas islands of Espiritu Santo, Fiji, Samoa, or Christmas Island, and have an AZOC covering those locations. Another way for Japan to achieve an auto-victory lies in the steamy jungles of Burma and India. This path, however, is not for the faint-hearted. A sustained ground war in Burma can quickly turn into a meat grinder, which can easily push Japanese resources beyond their breaking point. In the event that Japan fails in its attempt to achieve the knockout blow, you'll usually know by turn 8, they will have to play for the long haul, outlasting the overwhelming Allied war machine through the summer of 1945. Even a cursory examination of the reinforcement schedule will quickly show the disparity that Japan is facing. In order to win by this method, Japan will need to play flawlessly and procure a good amount of luck. U.S. industrial production is awesome. Now we would move on to the Allied reaction phase. Now during turn 1, the Allies are limited in their reaction ability. The forces at Pearl Harbor cannot conduct any reactions. Same goes for the British forces in Singapore. They cannot react. That leaves us with 3 viable reaction forces available. We would have the Dutch force at Surabaya, the Australian force in Brisbane, and the pre-war U.S. carrier force that is at sea somewhere off the coast of Pearl Harbor. Incidentally, during this playthrough, we'll be using the red dice for Japanese elite pilots, the white dice for standard Japanese pilots and standard naval roles, and the blue die will be used for Allied air and naval roles. We'll begin the reaction phase by determining the disposition of the U.S. carrier reaction force. It's going to be a die roll, and it will appear in one of 6 different possible locations. All right, here is the roll. The roll is a 4, and that is going to appear in the Ellis Islands. So we'll place the Lexington and Saratoga, the Northampton, and a Benham-class destroyer in Ellis. So that won't affect either Pearl Harbor or our Wake Island invasion, which were possibilities. As for the other 2 reactionary forces, I really don't think that any Allied player would authorize the Perth to either engage those forces of the Tokyo Express in Rabaul or the carrier-supported landings in Leh. So I think that that's a done deal. The Dutch could react and attempt to intercept that invasion force in Brunei, but they would be outgunned. There's no doubt about that. There would be 2 destroyers and a heavy cruiser against a heavy cruiser and a destroyer squadron. So I don't think that would happen. So if that is the case, that is going to bring the Allied reaction phase to a close, and we'll move on to the air commitment phase. During the air commitment phase, the phasing player will designate aircraft to either be assigned to their own location or to an adjoining location using long-range aircraft. And we're going to have a total of 3 of those commitments for the Japanese. The first one is actually a formality, but we're going to commit the 2 air points that we have in the Marshall Islands to our attack in the Gilberts. Our next commitment is a total of 8 aircraft from Saigon, and those are going to attack British forces in Singapore. And finally, we're also going to commit 8 air points from Formosa, and they are going to support our attack on the Philippines in Manila. And we will commit those as well. That'll bring that step to a close, and we would move on now to the combat step. And I'm going to save that for the next video. We're going to resolve all of the submarine attacks and all combats on the board, and we'll see how successful our Japanese turn 1 strategy is working. A few things before I close this video, and that would be more referring to what I'm expecting to happen in turn 2. I think it would be important for us to get land-based aircraft transferred to Rabaul as soon as possible. Not only do they protect the base from enemy attacks, but they can support the advance of the 2nd Division across the Owen Stanley Ridge and into Port Moresby. In addition, a sizable carrier force must be kept on standby in either Palau or Truk to react to possible Allied countermoves in the South Pacific. Additional invasion forces should be assembled to land on Leyte and Guadalcanal as soon as possible. To me, the acquisition of Leyte is very important. Number one, it would give us an uninterrupted chain of bases stretching from Yokosuka to Truk. And by use of one hex deployment, we can technically move naval forces from Yokosuka all the way to Truk without spending transfer points, which would be very beneficial to us. So I think Leyte is very important. Not to mention, it has a naval capacity of 16 and an air capacity of 4, so it's a pretty decent base. Another important concept, I believe, would be to, before we undertake any attack on the oil fields of Surabaya, we need to secure Singapore first. On turn 2, Yamashita's 25th Army will be transported to Singapore along with a sizable battle fleet to provide offshore ground support. And because of the inherent possible victory point penalties that will start accruing on turn 4, we need to secure Singapore and Manila for that matter. The 15th Army in Bangkok, under the command of General Aida, is going to continue its expansion into Rangoon. Air assets from Formosa might be diverted to Saigon to allow for air assets to be moved to Bangkok. A small naval force could be sent to Rangoon to deny supply to the British garrison, making its capture more likely. And finally, a small force of light ships should be maintained at Yokosuka to allow for the transfer of ground forces to Paramashiro for a future landing against the Aleutians. So that is going to complete our initial moves for Japan, and we're going to end up resolving those in the next video. So until then, thanks for joining me at the Solo Gamers Club, and I hope to see you again for Chapter 2, where we're going to actually commence the play of the game. In the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a pleasant evening. Good night.